Evaluating common threats. In 2008, the same year that the new Security Plus certification was released, Information Week magazine published a strategic security study. They polled nearly 1,100 IT and business professionals about their priorities and plans for securing corporate assets. 66% of the respondents said that their vulnerability to breaches and malware code were, quote, the same as last year or worse, unquote. Considering the huge amount of money spent on security last year, this is not a very good return on investment. So, in this first nugget of the systems security domain of Security Plus, we'll begin by differentiating between various systems security threats, which is your first step towards security risk assessment. Now, one of the first security fundamentals is simply this. We don't give individual users or systems access to areas they're not supposed to have access to. So one of the first types of measures that's going to be taken against a system or a service is to basically escalate the privileges or increase permissions beyond those that are allowed by the security policy. Now, all of your operating systems or network operating systems, or let's say internetwork operating systems like routers and switches, all have mechanisms in place to make sure that individual users only have least privilege. In other words, you're only given access to the things you're supposed to have access to based on the credentials of the user account that you log on with, or your membership of some group, for example, let's say a Windows domain users account, or some other group accessing over a virtual private network connection, or possibly a role-based access control mechanism applied to, let's say, a SQL database or Microsoft SharePoint. So privilege escalation is something that can happen in your organization either on purpose or by default, or it can be an actual category of attack that looks for vulnerabilities on systems and services and then uses the situation to take advantage of them. Let me use basic security on a Cisco router for example. If we go to a Cisco router, the base privilege access is what's called the enable prompt. And you can see here, we go to this prompt, it's like the greater than symbol. I'm on a router called router X. When I type in the question mark, I can see the basic commands I can execute at what's called the user prompt. I can clear lines, I can basically log in as a particular user, I can do some monitoring commands, some basic show commands, I can see the version of the operating system I'm using, for example. But if I have the credentials of the privileged or administrative user of this particular router, I can actually type in enable and put in the higher credentials. I'll get much greater access to the router. For example, look at the prompt now. You can see it's got an X there, which shows I'm at the privilege exec prompt. Now, I can use all different types of commands, especially this configure command to enter configuration mode. I couldn't enter configuration mode at that previous user prompt. But now that I'm at the privileged exec prompt, I can enter configure mode to configure this router. So if I can escalate my privileges on systems from the basic user or the guest user to what we call admin privileges or root privileges, I can actually do a lot more to that device than I could normally. So this is one of the first basic concepts of security. It's making sure that users and systems only have the least amount of privileges in our security policy. Now we're going to talk a lot more about permissions later on when we look at access controls, but escalation of privileges is tied very closely to permissions. So if we look at this Vista machine, for example, and we go to the C drive, we can see if we right click and choose properties, we can look at the security tab on the C drive of this particular machine, and we can see we've got individual users and groups here. In this case, these are all groups, but you can see authenticated users, for example, have a certain amount of permissions. Once they're authenticated on this machine, they have special permissions. If we could click on this, we could go look at advanced, and we can see the special permissions that they allow on this machine by going to effective permissions. Now, what we want to look at here is just the difference between the system access, which can modify, read and execute and write, and someone, let's say, a normal user, which can read and execute, list contents, and read. So what we try to do in a escalation of privileges attack is try to escalate from a basic user to an administrator or to a system account where you have full or complete godlike access over the system. In other words, if I were a malicious user, I would try to escalate my privileges from the user to the administrator or the system on this particular operating system. Now, one of the primary reasons I would want to escalate privileges on a system if I'm a malicious hacker is to introduce something called malware into a networking environment or onto a system or onto a server. Malware is short for malicious software, and it refers to software programs that are typically designed to damage or perform some other unwanted actions on a computer system or systems. We're going to look at several different common examples of malware here in a second, looking at viruses and worms and Trojan horses and spyware. But before we do that, I want to talk about the different categories of threats, because we want to understand that malware and privilege escalation can happen in kind of 4 different environments. First of all, we want to look at threats that are what we call intentional. So I'm going to jot that down here. We've got intentional threats. And these are threats that are actually lodged against our system by a malicious, knowledgeable user. Then we have what are called unintentional. And this could be simply an uneducated user downloading some software by accident, or introducing a virus or a Trojan by accident, simply not being a knowledgeable security person. Maybe they're a victim of an email phishing attack. Then we have what are called internal attacks. And studies show us that over 60% of our attacks on our network, for example, are going to happen from an insider, an internal source, maybe a contractor or a temporary employee. And then we have attacks that are external. So generally speaking, our malware introduction into our systems that can do the most damage via privileged escalation or escalation of privileges are going to be combinations of either intentional internal attacks or intentional external attacks. There may be unintentional internal attacks, or there may be unintentional external attacks. I want you to understand these 4 different categories of attacks on your system and realize that malware can be introduced into a network through different combinations of these types of attacks. The most obvious type of malware is that of a virus, and viruses have been around for a long time. They're simply just computer programs that can do the same thing that other programs do on your computer. It's a program that spreads by first infecting files or system areas of a network, or maybe even a router on your network, its hard drive. What it does is it makes copies of itself. Now, some of these viruses can be harmless by just filling up your hard drive with, let's say, little .eml files, or they can be very damaging. They can destroy files, system files, boot sector files, and other system files. Now, back in the day when we used to use shared floppy disks a lot and other portable media, it was very common to get a virus from a floppy disk. Nowadays, viruses are primarily spread using email messages. Next, I want to break down some of the many different types of viruses, and there's quite a few of them. First, let's talk about some of the more popular types of viruses that are being exploded on our networks right now to kind of circumvent virus protection software, and that is polymorphic viruses. A polymorphic virus can modify itself to avoid detection from antivirus software. They attack our systems, they attack our servers, they attack our hosts, they'll display messages on our computers, sometimes they'll delete files from our system. They try to hide from our antivirus suites. In addition, a polymorphic virus can actually encrypt parts of itself to avoid detection as well. This is called mutation. When a polymorphic virus mutates, it makes it even harder for the software to detect its characteristics. Polymorphic viruses leverage the fact that antivirus software uses signatures, so it will modify its signature in order to bypass the antivirus software suite. Another type of virus is a stealth virus, and this is similar to polymorphic virus as far as it hiding itself to avoid detection. It also will hide by masking itself from antivirus applications or AV apps. Sometimes these stealth viruses attach themselves to the boot sector of the hard drive on a server or a PC. Then, when a system utility or an application runs, the stealth virus will redirect commands around itself to avoid detection. In addition, an infected file might report a file size different from what it actually presents to avoid detection as well. Remember, a lot of antivirus software are going to look for particular defined file sizes. So a stealth virus may actually represent a different size than it actually is. A retrovirus is a virus attack that bypasses antivirus software installed in our computers. A retrovirus is kind of an anti-antivirus. It directly attacks your antivirus software, potentially destroying the virus definition database file. Prime example of this is a retrovirus that is geared towards attacking this Cisco security agent, or the CSA, that runs in a host-based intrusion prevention system environment. A multipartite virus will attack your system in multiple ways, or multipartite. It may try to infect all of our executable files, it may destroy application files, it may also simultaneously infect the boot sector. It's kind of like throwing mud up against the wall and seeing what sticks. The plan here is that the antivirus software or the administrator won't be able to address all the problems, and therefore the infestation will continue. While you're mitigating the application file destruction and executable file destruction, it'll go ahead and infect your boot sector. Another common target of multipartite viruses is Microsoft Word. An armored virus has the goal of making itself difficult to analyze or detect, similar to a stealth and polymorphic virus as well. They're going to cover themselves with a layer of protective code that prevents debuggers or disassemblers from examining critical elements of that armored virus. People who write armored viruses may write the program to act as a decoy to distract analysis, while the actual code will hide in other areas of memory or other areas of the program. The longer it takes to penetrate an armored virus, the longer it can live and do damage. The longer it lives, the more time it can replicate and spread to as many machines as possible. Remember, one of the key components to stopping viruses and worms is to identify them as quickly as possible and then to spread information about those viruses or worms. But armored viruses address the very thing that we try to do as system administrators, and that is quickly identify the virus. A companion virus attaches itself to legitimate programs. This is one of the most common aspects of historical viruses. They attach themselves to legitimate games and legitimate shareware, and then they create a program with a different file extension. This companion file might reside in your system's temporary directory, for example, or a system directory. Then, if a user types in the name of the legitimate program, the companion virus will run instead of the actual program. Therefore, the virus is being hidden from the user. Many of these types of companion viruses are used to attack the Windows registry, the Windows configuration database. A phage virus, its goal is to alter and modify other programs and other databases. A phage virus will affect all of your database files. Only way you can get rid of these is to reinstall the application that's infected. If your antivirus software misses even a single incident of the phage virus on the system, the process will start over again and infect the system once more. These are really difficult to get rid of. Maybe you've run into one of these, you get rid of almost all the aspects of it, but then there's one little crumb left behind. Next time you restart your machine, that full-blown virus raises its ugly head all over again. A macro virus is actually a clever little program that runs in Microsoft Office products like Word and Excel, which allow programmers to expand the capabilities of the application. These are like mini programs, or little component programs that are added into Word and Excel to add functionality. Macro viruses are one of the fastest growing exploits found out there in the world today. Now, it's really important to differentiate between a virus and a worm, because a virus is often used kind of as a generic phrase to describe malware, but there are some key differences. Remember, a virus is going to propagate itself by infecting other programs on the same computer. Typically, they're not spread to other computers without some type of human assistance, like opening an infected file on a floppy disk or an email attachment, or through file sharing. A worm, however, is going to execute arbitrary code and install itself or load itself up into the memory of the infected computer. So a worm is different than a virus in that its goal is to infect other hosts from the infected computer. A worm can spread itself automatically over the network from one computer to the next without user intervention. They don't need to attach to an existing program. The goal of a worm is typically to consume resources, consume memory, consume processor, consume disk space. They don't typically modify or delete or corrupt files like a virus does. Some worms are only designed to spread across a network. Then they can deliver their payload, which might be a virus or a Trojan horse program. A common payload is to install a backdoor program onto a PC or a server, which you can use as a launching point for let's say, a distributed denial of service attack. And we'll talk more about those later on. Now, if we have a worm here, let me just draw a little worm. If I got a worm, okay, that's my worm. A worm has 3 parts. So I'm going to go and dissect my worm like I'm in a science class. First, you have the enabling vulnerability. So I'll just put V here. The worm is going to install itself on a vulnerable system. Let's say a PC that's not running Cisco's host intrusion prevention system, or maybe some third-party security suite from McAfee or Symantec. Then you've got what's called the propagation mechanism. I'll just put a P here. Once the worm gets access to the device, the worm does what it does. It replicates and it finds new targets in the network. Then you've got what's called the payload, and I'll just put pay here. After the worm infects the device, the attacker then has access to the host, oftentimes as a privileged user, like I showed you earlier at the privilege exec prompt, or maybe a system account or an admin account on a Windows workstation or server. The payload will then include an attack that uses a local exploit on the server or workstation to escalate their privilege level to admin level. And as I mentioned, the payload can be a wide variety of different types of malware. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about mitigation of attacks later on in this Security Plus series, but let me just real quickly give you from the Network Service Provider Security Forum Incident Response Team a methodology, and it subdivides the common incident response for viruses and worms into 6 categories. You should kind of know this process. Step 1 is to prepare. You're going to get the resources you need to respond to attacks. One of those resources would be this Security Plus nugget. The second is to identify the worm. Identify the worm or the virus. 3, classify what type of worm or malware that it is. Then 4, trace it, trace back. Trace the worm or the malware back to its origin if possible. Then 5, react. Isolate and repair the affected systems. And then finally, document. Document and analyze the process so you'll have this information for the future. Now, one of your really big tools that you're going to use for, and before we go on and look at my suite that I have here on my system, let's talk about the third kind of category. That's Trojan horses. I really kind of brushed over that. Let me just mention that to you real quickly. A Trojan horse refers to this is kind of a general category, by the way. This is not a specific type of attack, but a Trojan horse attack is a generic term that refers to malware that looks desirable, like it looks like a game or some type of device driver, but it actually contains something very harmful. A lot of downloaded games and freeware and shareware are going to contain possible Trojan horse programs. They're also going to contain things like spyware and adware as well, which can loosely be defined as malware. A Trojan horse attacks on 3 different levels. And the love bug, I'll just jot that down, was a really good example of a Trojan horse attack because it pretended to be a love letter when it actually carried a harmful program. The love bug was a virus, but it was a Trojan horse virus. It affected all the image files on the attached disk, turning them into new Trojan horses. But the love bug was also a worm because it propagated itself over the internet by hiding in the Trojan horse program itself that it sent out using addresses in the attacked email address book. So again, there can be a fine line between these different types of malware. Just have a general idea of that a Trojan horse is something that it doesn't appear to be, kind of like the Trojan horse that was brought in by the Greeks into the city of Troy, filled with a bunch of soldiers. It wasn't a gift, it was an attack. Now, your first line of defense for viruses and worms and Trojan horses and other types of malware is to use an up-to-date virus protection program on your computer. Most of the time you're going to use some type of security suite, let's say from Symantec or McAfee or another company like Microsoft. For example, on my Vista machine here, I've got what's called Windows OneCare. And Windows Live OneCare is a way that I can stay actively connected to the internet and get updates for security threats to my system. This is a $44.95 a year service, and by paying for this, I actually was able to get this for 3 computers. So I can apply this to this computer and 2 other computers or PCs in my home office, small office, home office. And you can see here, it backs up files and it does tune-ups, for example, like defragmentation. It also can allow you to go turn off unused programs. This is what you call system hardening, and you should do this. You should harden your system to turn off services and servers and programs that you don't need. Those use TCP and UDP ports that are typically vulnerable to different types of attacks. But I can also go and I can scan for viruses and spyware, and I'll talk about spyware and adware here in a second. But what I want to do is I want to check for updates. You always want to make sure that your system has the most recent worm and virus update. So I click on the link and it goes, and down here you can see in the bottom it says Windows Live OneCare Updates. It's checking for updates. So you can configure your security suites to go and do this on a regular basis, maybe once a week. You can view a monthly report, and you can do a firewall protection, which I've got firewall. This is like a privacy feature. It also allows me to be notified through Vista if certain services or servers or programs are trying to use the internet. Maybe I don't want them to. I've also got a phishing filter. We'll talk about phishing a little bit later on, but phishing is just a method to trick users through email to go to nefarious websites, among other things. So I've got my phishing filter on in IE7, I've got my firewall on, and I'm checking for updates. And it tells me that I'm up to date as of July 29th, 2008. So I'm ready to go on this system. Now it's telling me the status is fair for my security, but really the reason why it's saying it's fair is because I haven't backed up my files, and I can configure backup to an external USB hard drive or some other mechanism, and tune up. So if I were to back up and tune up, my status would go to excellent. Another security threat that's very common is that of spam, and spam is often more of an annoyance than it is a threat, but spam can fill up hard drives, it can slow down resources, it can be a denial of service attack in its own right. So I'm going to go ahead and go down here on my Vista machine to my Windows Mail, which is really Outlook Express but glorified into Vista. And you can see most of your new email programs now are going to have a folder built in called junk email. This is spam. Okay, and so it already has filters and techniques built into it to look for known spam characteristics, and we'll put those in the junk email folder as they come into your system. But you can go up to Tools, and you've got junk email options, for example, where you can go and you can configure your, this is again junk email equals spam, and you can see where I mentioned phishing here. Okay, and we'll talk more about phishing attacks a little bit later on, but when I go to my options here, I can choose different levels of spam protection. I can say don't filter it, just put the most obvious spam into the junk email folder, or put it on high where it catches most of it, but realize you may have some false positives. In other words, where some irregular mail is caught as well and put into your junk email folder. So you have to check your junk email folder like it's your inbox on a regular basis. Or you can do what's called a safe list. If you choose this option, you can go in and you can literally say which individual email accounts and which domains are on my safe senders list. only these are sent into your inbox. And sometimes when you go to subscribe to different services, or you get in mailing lists, or you get into join a particular group, and they're going to send you email from, let's say, yahoo.com or whatever, they may remind you, hey, you need to add us to your safe list so that you won't go to the junk email folder. So this is a good way to go in and manage on your client systems junk email policy for spam, because spam can be very annoying, and in an enterprise organization, spam can really reduce productivity by adding a lot of extra traffic. It can overwhelm processors, it can overwhelm disk space, it can add to the backups, the size of the backups that you make from your systems, and they can just introduce phishing attacks into your organization. So in an enterprise organization from Microsoft, for example, I would probably manage this for all my clients through some type of group policy mechanism for all of my client machines. So that's spam, or junk email as it's now referred to. Next, I want to talk about 3 other categories of malware that you may come in contact with. We've got rootkits, we've got botnets, and we've got logic bombs. Now, rootkits fall into the category of what we call software exploitation. Now, there's several types of exploitation that can happen in your enterprise. You can have exploitation of your database, your SQL database, for example. You can have other application exploitation, for example, Microsoft Office products. You've got macro viruses that'll work, for instance, with VB script within an Office environment. We've got email exploitation. We've talked about that already a little bit, and we'll see some more of that coming up. Rootkits have been kind of the software exploitation of the day. These are programs that have the ability to hide information from the operating system. For example, if I were to go and run the Task Manager, you can see that different programs and processes are running under the Applications and Processes tab of Task Manager. What a rootkit can do is it can run on my Vista system or my Windows XP system, for example, and not even show up in the Task Manager. It won't even show up that a connection is established with, let's say, the netstat command. A rootkit does this by manipulating function calls to our operating system and filtering out information that would normally appear. The goal of a rootkit, let me go ahead and close this out. The goal of a rootkit is to exploit the operating system, to take fundamental control. For example, in Unix it would be root access, in Windows administrator access of the system, without any authorization by the owner of the system or legitimate administrators. Usually a rootkit is going to obscure their presence on the operating system through some type of standard evasion tactic or bypassing ordinary security mechanisms. In addition, a rootkit can be a Trojan as well, fooling users into believing that these are safe to run on their systems when in fact they're installing a rootkit. And there's rootkits out there for a variety of operating systems, Windows, Linux, and Solaris being the most popular. Rootkits will very often modify portions of the operating system or even install themselves as device drivers or kernel modules in the case of Solaris and Linux, depending upon the internal aspects of the operating system's operating mechanisms. Next, we have a botnet, and a botnet is basically an automatic software robot that is launched onto the public internet with a variety of nefarious goals. Botnets typically refer to a group of what we call zombie computers, or hosts that have been compromised with different types of software. And these have been installed using worms or Trojan horse programs that I mentioned, or other backdoor programs. And it uses kind of a command and control infrastructure where you've got a remote device or a remote server controlling that zombie host inside of an organization. Typically, botnets are found in Microsoft Windows operating systems. Typically, a bot is going to be a hidden program compromising a series of systems using a variety of exploitation tools, buffer overflows, and other mechanisms. Some of the newer bots can actually automatically scan the environment and then propagate themselves based on weak passwords or other system or service vulnerabilities. So the more vulnerabilities a bot can scan on the PC or the server, the more valuable it will become to the individual host that's controlling the botnet itself. Botnets are actually quite prevalent on the internet. And finally, we have logic bombs that are typically programs that are launched when certain conditions are met. These are full-blown programs or little code chunks that execute when a certain predefined event happens. The bomb could actually send a note to the user when they log on to the internet. It can show up in their word processor. And the logic bomb can be built around a particular date, for example. Let's say Valentine's Day or April Fool's Day or the anniversary of some famous event like 9/11, for example. So they can actually launch at a certain predetermined time. Next, we're going to look at a couple of concepts of malware, spyware and adware, which are sometimes confused as the same thing, and sometimes they can actually be the same thing. But let's look at spyware first. And spyware is software that's installed on PCs without the knowledge of the user or the owner of the PC. And the goal of spyware is to intercept calls to the operating system, intercept calls to the internet on behalf of browsers, for example, to actually take control, to monitor, and redirect without the user's informed consent. Spyware can be used to collect personal information off of a PC. It can track surfing habits. It can redirect browsers to nefarious sites on the internet where personal information can be gathered, where additional software can be installed, or where the website has a more harmful virus or a worm. It'll also be used to divert advertising revenues to third-party sites. Some clever spyware can actually change computer settings, modify the home page of a browser, or even interrupt the internet connection. Now, there's a whole desktop industry that deals with anti-spyware software. What's ironic is actually some of these programs that actually advertise anti-spyware and anti-adware themselves introduce spyware and adware. So you have to be very careful that you're using programs that are actually legitimate. Now, an adware is basically going to be a program that introduces advertising, pop-up ads and other ads into your browser and your operating system. Most adware is actually legit. If you go up and you download programs from certain websites, maybe you participate in peer-to-peer file sharing like Morpheus or Kazaa or eDonkey, when you agree to those file sharing services, you're agreeing to install and download adware onto your machine. There's several sites on the internet that allow you to go and, let's say, download music files for, let's say, a monthly fee, and it seems really cheap. You have unlimited downloads of music files for a small fee, but what you're agreeing to is you're agreeing to allow adware to be put on your machine. And adware, of course, is going to introduce pop-ups and other type of advertisements. Again, some adware can also be embedded in things like Adobe Reader, AIM or AOL Instant Messenger, Yahoo Messenger, Smiley, Zango. I mentioned Kazaa already. So adware can be considered a form of spyware, but spyware and adware are really two different categories. Now, unlike viruses and worms, spyware and adware doesn't typically self-replicate, but spyware can exploit infected computers for commercial gain. A couple of programs that you can use for removal are Adaware, ADAWARE, and Spybot, two good programs for removing spyware and adware from your machines. Here's an example of a dialog box or security warning you might get in your Windows operating system when a malicious website tries to install spyware on your computer. And here's an example of a program I mentioned to you, Adaware 2008, which is a program you can use to detect and remove spyware, adware, and other newer types of malware. Keep it updated like you would any other type of antivirus or AV program, and you can keep your system spyware and adware free. Adaware is from a company called Lavasoft. Here's a prime example of adware that'll pop up on your machine, courtesy of tribalfusion.com. It's just an advertisement for Netflix free trial. This is the kind of stuff that'll pop up over and over and over on your machine, including other types of sites as well. If you get adware, it could be gaming sites, poker sites, adult sites, all types of stuff you may or may not want on your machine. Now on my Vista machine, built into the newer operating system sometimes, when you have pop-ups or adware, you can get a dialog box like this one that asks you to notice the information bar, and you can see from the information bar that the pop-up was blocked, also to help protect your security. And if you go to the tools area on your browser, you typically have an area where you can turn off your pop-up blocker. For example, if I go and take a look at my browser, and I'm using IE7, if I go to Tools, I've got a pop-up blocker setting here where I can turn off the pop-up blocker, or I can configure pop-up blocker settings, individual allowed sites, or whitelist certain sites. And I can also get notifications, playing sounds, or there's that information bar that we talked about, and I've got these set up. I've also got different built-in filter levels that come with my IE7 browser in Vista as well. You know, when we think about security vulnerabilities to our systems, whether they're internal or external or planned or unplanned, we typically think about software or protocols and services. But there are also quite a few risks and many more emerging threats to actual hardware and peripherals. We've actually got new attacks that can exploit the microcode errors in a CPU. Remember, a lot of your peripheral devices have a lot of onboard memory. They have basic input-output systems or BIOSes built on that can be exploited. Onboard memory and buffers that can also be, these are video cards, audio cards, gaming cards, accelerator cards, all types of new attacks out there exploiting known errors and flaws in the design. And they can be exploited by malicious code that attack and compromise systems. Doesn't matter which operating system you're using, doesn't matter what other software you're using. We used to worry about information being stored on floppy disks. Well, USB devices, USB storage devices like thumb drives and USB keys can hold a lot more information now, well beyond 4 gigabytes of information, and you can hold a lot more malicious software, and that software can actually be hidden on those drives as well. So USB devices are actually the floppy of today, and they're a heck of a lot more dangerous because they can store a lot more information, a lot more malware. Any removable storage device, whether it's USB, even a removable CD drive or DVD drive, can be exploited. As a matter of fact, a virus can copy itself over to your DVD burner's buffer. It's actually called, on a DVD burner, buffer EEK. It'll actually be able to evade any of your antivirus software, and then it copies itself back to the hard disk drive, sometimes shredding files and causing other hardware to go south. So we've got all different types of things out there that really you need a good hardware firewall if you're at a small to medium-sized business. A software firewall that comes with a security suite, let's say from Microsoft or Symantec or McAfee, is your first line of defense on your PC or your home-based workstation. But any small to medium-sized business should be using some type of hardware firewall technology to help us keep introducing this type of code. Even intrusion prevention systems can benefit us here as well. And we'll talk more about those mitigation mechanisms a little bit later on in this Nugget series. But there's a couple other areas I want to touch on that are addressed on the exam, and that is security through cell phones and security through network attached storage. You know, more and more cell phones are performing as really PDA devices, kind of personal digital assistants or handheld devices. They connect to the internet, they have browsing features on them, and people forget about the vulnerability to cell phones as it exposes itself to the public internet. Also, people think that cell phones aren't traceable, so they can really do whatever they want to with a cell phone. That's not true. A cell phone, once it's turned on, it immediately identifies with a cell that's closest to it, and that cell system can triangulate that cell user to within a few feet. So even when your phone's not turned on, this can still be done. So realize that your cell phone is really kind of a tracking device. There are types of wireless security protocols that are used with cell phone and handheld devices. This is part of wireless transport layer security, or we call WTLS. Another protocol that's used with, and this is a very popular one with Cisco, as a matter of fact, for PDA and handheld devices, it's ECC, which stands for elliptic curve cryptography. And these are kind of thin cryptography clients that can be installed on handheld devices and cell phones to give you encryption, privacy, and integrity and confidentiality on those cell phones and handheld devices. We'll talk about this type of encryption a little bit later on in this Nugget series. But again, cell phones themselves, with their access to the internet and their access to wireless technology, are also vulnerable and subject to all types of risk. Now, there are also systems called network attached storage and storage area networking. Let me add that to it. These are two types of very popular high-speed network access topologies that typically are going to connect to data farms, web server farms, high-speed connectivity to data centers, for example, part of a local area network or wide area network topology. And we have to understand these are high-speed data network connectivity methodologies, so they're going to be subject to different types of attacks. For example, if a distributed denial of service attack can be introduced into a high-speed network attached storage topology or a storage area network to a server farm, like a data farm or a web server farm, because of the high-speed nature of that, the distributed denial of service attack is going to spread itself very, very quickly, much quicker than any administrator or system can be able to mitigate that. And because NAS and SAN typically are based on IP protocol and they use Ethernet, that opens them up to all of the types of vulnerabilities that you find in the IP protocol at layer 3 and the Ethernet protocol at layer 1 and layer 2 of the OSI model. Now, a lot of these also use what are called iSCSI, and iSCSI itself also has its own security vulnerabilities. Now, those are beyond the scope of this particular exam, but you want to understand that a lot of times what's going to be done to mitigate and prevent attacks when using these high-speed networking storage capabilities to, let's say, a server farm, a data farm, or a web server farm, is going to be using some type of IPsec solution. And that's going to be providing encryption and authentication between the devices that are moving over this network attached storage or storage area network. IP security is going to provide encryption, authentication, data integrity through using hashing mechanisms, and that way if any information is sniffed or snooped off the wire, it'll be in cybertext and will be unreadable. Something else is also introduced at these points, these connection points between the server farm and maybe a router that's connecting these network attached storages or SANs. It could be a router or a server, is to use what's called intrusion prevention services and to apply sensors, either software or hardware sensors, at these two endpoints, so that if some type of vulnerability rears its ugly head based on a signature, pattern matching, or an anomaly detection, it'll send an alert to an administrator, either administrative station, okay, or to an individual user via email or a pager or some other monitoring device, and they'll know of that threat rearing its ugly head. So there's the faster the mechanism of storage and sending data, the quicker an attack is going to propagate on your network. So IPsec and intrusion prevention systems are good choices for those high-speed connectivities to server farms, data farms, and data centers. All right. Alright, well, in this first nugget of the systems security domain of the Security Plus exam, we looked at 4 key areas. We looked at privilege escalation, talked about malware, all different types of malware, viruses, worms, trojans, spyware, adware, spam. We looked at rootkits, botnets, and logic bombs, and then finally talked about some of the prevalent risks to hardware and peripherals. I hope this CPT nugget has been informative for you. I want to thank you for viewing. We'll see you in the next nugget.